Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at the Administration of Justice program within the United Nations, and they deal with some very interesting and some very unique issues, but they're not only unique to the UN, but perhaps to other groups around the world and other businesses. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Ms. Alayne Frankson Wallace, a Jamaican national, who is the Executive Director of the United Nations Office of Administration of Justice. Ms. Frankson Wallace served as Ombudsman for the United Nations funds and programs, and prior to that, she was the Ethics Advisor with the UN Development Program, commonly called UNDP. Ms. Alayne Frankson Wallace, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. I'm happy to be with you today.
I appreciate you being with me today. You've got a varied career. I just touched the tip of the iceberg here, and we'll get into it. Let's talk about the Administration of Justice operation within the UN. What exactly is this? When was it formed? Why was it formed? And what's your main mission?
Okay. The UN has staff from all corners of the world. And this is the talent that we rely on to implement the important programs in humanitarian assistance, in sustainable development, in peace and security, among other things for the people of the world. When we bring together this diverse mix of people, there are times when disagreements will arise or conflicts. Sometimes the disagreement is between members of the same team, but sometimes as employees in the organization, they may have a disagreement with the organization as their employer. The UN, as an exemplary employer, must provide effective recourse mechanisms for its staff. In 2009, the General Assembly decided to implement a new, independent, transparent, professionalized, adequately resourced, and decentralized system for UN staff. The system has an informal component as well as a formal component. And in that case, we have the Ombudsman's Office, which is largely the informal element of the system. And the Office of the Ombudsman also provides mediation services. On the formal side, which is where I really come in as Executive Director, we have a two-tiered tribunal system. So we have professional judges who are adjudicating disputes that staff members may have in the organization.
Now, these might be disputes between staff, among staff members, perhaps also with their supervisors or somebody else within the UN system.
Yes.
Right. Now, you mentioned the informal and formal mechanisms. Could you talk a little bit about each of those, just a little more detail on each?
Okay, as I was the ombudsman for the funds and programs, I do have some practical know-how about dealing with it. The informal mechanism through the Ombudsman's Office really provides a safe space for individuals who may have a grievance in the workplace to work through those issues using mechanisms like mediation, like facilitated dialogue, or in some instances the Ombudsman really coaches the individual staff member to empower them to deal with the issue as they feel would best suit their needs. The informal resolution context really gives people ownership of the issue. And in that sense, they're empowered, because when you're able to identify what would be the best solution to solve your problem, and if you're able to have a conversation with another party who is involved in the issue, together they can find mutually agreeable solutions. So we actually really emphasize the use of informal resolution in the United Nations. Of course, the kind of organization that we are, we believe in dialogue. And so informal resolution for us should be the first step that a staff member with a grievance tries to resolve the issue. We know, though, that there are times that there are issues that cannot be resolved informally. Sometimes the issue might be in relation to how to interpret a legislative document. And in those circumstances, we may need to have a formal resolution. But even before we get to the tribunal, the UN has what we call a management evaluation review. And here, staff members who are trained lawyers, who are skilled in the internal legislative framework of the organization will look at a decision that is being contested and review it against the framework to see if it's a good decision. And of course, they may come back to the staff member and say, well, this is really a good decision. We believe it is. The staff member may not be satisfied with that outcome, and so they have the option of then appealing to the UN Dispute Tribunal as the first tier in the two-tiered system. As I said, Bill, we have professional judges drawn from different jurisdictions across the globe. The judges are appointed by the General Assembly, so they're not under the authority of the Secretary General in any way. And in that respect, they exercise impartial decision-making in relation to contested decisions that are filed. When the UN Dispute Tribunal makes a determination on the issue, it is binding if the parties decide not to appeal. But there are times when one or other side, so the applicant, staff member, or the respondent, the Secretary General, may believe that the decision is not sound, and they have the option of appealing to the UN Appeals Tribunal. The Appeals Tribunal makes the final determination on the issue, and of course it then is binding on the parties and on the organization.
I see. Now, the UN is the only multilateral institution of its type in the world. There's no other place where all 193 countries come together, the leaders of the world come together under one roof to deal with problems, to deal with issues, and hopefully resolve them peacefully. And in most cases, they actually do. There's some where they don't, but in most cases they do. But still, you have, of those, you have 193 countries. And you mentioned the diversity of the UN staff. You can correct me on this, I would guess there probably, out of 193, probably 140 or 150 countries have people from their countries working in the UN system. Is that about right, or is it higher than that?
In recruitment, the UN really focuses also on skills, but gender and geographic distribution. So we do cultivate having a diverse workforce. So there are, I think, most if not all countries are represented, whether in the United Nations, but also in funds, programs, and entities of the UN. So we do have a global workforce in the real sense. In addition to that, through the funds, programs, and entities, the UN also has a presence in a lot of these countries. So a local staff who are hired in, say, a UNDP country office will come from that country. So we do also have that element of the workforce, which comes from the country in which, or the territory in which we're operating.
So you have a set of criteria, professional criteria that you try to meet.
Yes.
Now, many of our viewers are probably saying, well, that's nice, it applies to the United Nations. Doesn't apply to me, I'm in the media business, I work for a newspaper, it doesn't apply to me, I work in a chemical plant or wherever it might be, or I'm an environmentalist. But virtually every company, at least in the United States that I can think of, they're undergoing similar types of exercises, are they not, to some degree? I know you're not a spokesperson or a spokesman for them, but they're all dealing with these types of arbitration and mediation and looking at how they can have a more productive workforce and one that gets along together. So a lot of these are principles that go into the private sector, into other governmental agencies, other regional organizations.
The way I see it, Bill, when you have two or more human beings together, even in a family, there are going to be disagreements. And what we have recognized is that there's a cost to conflict. There's a cost to the individual, but there's also a cost to anybody else who is involved in it, even indirectly, and there's a cost to an organization. So it is in the interest of any organization to have effective recourse mechanisms for its workforce so that these issues can be resolved as efficiently and as effectively as possible, because you really need your staff to be energized. You need to be able to harness their creativity and their innovative skills to focus on your programmatic work. And in that sense, it is no different for the UN, because we have very important and meaningful programs that we have to implement. The peoples of the world look to the United Nations in many of these regions where you have conflicts or you have humanitarian crises. The people look to the United Nations for assistance. And so we need our workforce to be fully engaged with ensuring that we're implementing the mandates of the organization.
It's very important. And before the show, we were talking about the number of UN staff, and you mentioned the number of about 70,000, more or less a ballpark figure, not exactly. And of course, that's 70,000 staff to cover the world. a lot of people may think, well, that's a lot of employees. Well, it's actually been reduced, if I understand it, from many years ago through reductions and what have you, energy or efficiency cuts, or a variety of other things at the UN. But when you stop and think about 70,000 people covering the world, that's a very small number. I'm from Kentucky. We got 4.5 million people, and we have 60,000 public employees, counting teachers and state governmental employees. So 70,000 to cover the world that's spread out quite a bit, is it not?
It really is. We do have a global presence, but the size of the operation that the UN will have in any location will depend on the programmatic work. So for instance, we will have peacekeeping operations, and at the startup of a peacekeeping operations, the particular mission may need a certain number of people, a certain skill set, but through the life cycle of the mission, then there will be downsizing that will occur, and so there will be shrinking the size of the workforce. So it's very mobile, it's also very fluid, depending on what has to be done.
Now, you've just recently been appointed to this position, but you're familiar with the program. It started basically 10 years ago, right?
Yes.
At 10 years ago.
Yes, it did.
And how have you evaluated where the program was 10 years ago to where it is today? I'm sure that you have evaluation mechanisms and that type of thing to see the developments and the progress being made, areas that need to be strengthened. But how do you look at that today as opposed to your predecessors who were there 10 years ago looking at it?
Well, when the system started, it was in response to what was the previous system and some of the challenges that the organization identified. The previous system was slow and it was cumbersome. And the General Assembly also recognized that we would want to professionalize the system and make it independent. And so this new system, which came into effect in 2009, has brought a number of new features, one of which, as I said earlier, was the independent judiciary. And this is something new for the United Nations. It is really unusual to have judges who are in-house, so to speak, on a day-to-day basis. So the UN Dispute Tribunal has 3 seats. One is in New York, one is in Geneva, and one is in Nairobi. And there is a full-time judge in each of these locations. Previously, we had also one full-time ad litem judge who was at each seat. Last year, the General Assembly made some determinations regarding the structure of the UN Dispute Tribunal. And so the ad litem judges have been replaced with 4 new half-time judges. So now we have 3 full-time judges, 1 in each location. We previously had 2 half-time judges. Those have been retained, and we've added 4. So we have 6 half-time judges in the UNDT. And this is really to enhance the decentralization, but also to enhance efficiency and to ensure that judicial capacity is available to deal with caseload wherever it arises.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections Television are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a website and you just like our shows and you want to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking an inside peek at the United Nations and getting an overview of really a unique system that I think will be of interest to everyone. My guest today is going to talk to us about it, and she has been. My guest today is Ms. Alayne Frankson Wallace, a Jamaican national who's Executive Director of the United Nations Office of Administration of Justice. We're talking about this system. We're talking about the number of employees, 70,000 roughly, that could be under this, have some type of recourse here, shall we say. How do you get the word out to them? How do you let them know that this system is in place to help them? And we'll get into a few other specifics, but yes, how do you get that word out?
Yes. Well, what is at one point the advantage of the organization in terms of the global spread and the fact that we're working in some of these deep field locations also can present a challenge in terms of disseminating information for our staff. At the same time, we have a mobile and fluid workforce, so you never get to a situation where everybody has perfect knowledge of the system. So getting the word out has required a comprehensive outreach strategy. We use multi-partner and multimedia methods to communicate with staff. It is critical that every staff member, even if they don't have a problem today, but if they have a problem sometime during their employment with the organization, knows where to go for help. And so we partner with other offices like ethics offices, who themselves have their own outreach methods, the Office of the Ombudsman and Mediation Services, which is also decentralized and has regional ombudsmen in some of these deep field and peacekeeping locations. They also assist in getting the word out. We have a website where we pull together the different elements of the system and provide holistic information for all staff so that they're able to make connections between the informal part and the formal part. In addition to which, Bill, all of the judgments are published. Absent any reason for confidentiality, these are made publicly available on the website. So a staff member who has an issue, who wants to get a better understanding of how to deal with it or what the outcome might be at the tribunal, can also access the jurisprudence from our website.
So it's there. It is open. You can take a look at it.
Yes, and from time to time, different offices also conduct outreach missions. So the Office of Staff Legal Assistance, for instance, where the lawyers for staff will visit individual offices or regional offices and have clinics with staff members. The Management Evaluation Unit also does clinics, and I myself from time to time will have town hall meetings to share information with the staff, because ultimately we want the staff to understand the system and to use the system.
It seems, as I talk to people inside the UN and observers who've watched the UN, many since the UN was formed in 1945, but they've indicated the early years of the UN was not as focused on staff training, that type of thing, providing mechanisms for staff to have input into the process and that type of thing. But that has changed today. I remember when Kofi Annan, I guess he was the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations, as I recall, but he had a two-track proposal to streamline the United Nations to make it more efficient and more effective. Do you folks talk about that proposal, or did that help jumpstart this whole initiative to professionalize the UN, to make it more efficient, to make it more effective?
Well, the UN has to evolve as society evolves, because otherwise it would become irrelevant. And managing people and getting the best out of your people is just modern and makes good business sense, if you want to look at it that way. Because at the end of the day, you're going to get the best out of an employee who feels valued in the workplace, who comes to work every day meaning to and having the opportunity to contribute to the mission of the organization. And they must feel as they come in the respect and dignity for each of them as an individual, regardless of their race, their nationality, their ethnic origin. Anything that may distinguish them should not be a barrier. And the UN values that. We take great pride in it, and in fact we want to believe that we're the global leaders when it comes to respecting those innate qualities. So it behoves us as an organization and as an employer to create an environment where we get the best out of our people.
There's a term that we've been using for the past several years called whistleblower.
Yes.
And it's very prominent in the private sector, it's prominent in governmental agencies, non-governmental organizations. I think any group that has any type of business. How do you deal with the whistleblower issue? Does that fall under your purview? Is there some mechanism to allow someone who's in the system who may have valuable information that's being suppressed by a superior, someone in the line of command or chain of command or something like that? How do you deal with that?
So that doesn't fall under the Office of Administration of Justice.
Oh, okay.
The Ethics Office was established to deal with whistleblower protection, among other conflicts of interest and ethics guidance that staff need to go about their day-to-day work. Because ultimately, everything that we do as an organization must be undergirded by integrity, and we have to safeguard the reputation and the image of the organization. And there are times when individuals' personal relationships or their professional relationships, sometimes even the question of whether or not to become involved in a political activity may arise, and the organization provides an ethics office which can give staff confidential advice on how to mitigate these perceptions or apparent or real conflicts so that the organization is able to continue its work and having the confidence of people who are partners or donors but also are beneficiaries. So that falls squarely under the ethics office.
Ethics office, I see. Well, do you have any new or additional proposals that you could share today on how you're going to professionalize, make the office even more effective, more efficient, and professionalize it in the future? Do you have something in the pipeline right now?
Well, we've made a very good start with the system, and in 2015 we had an interim independent assessment of the internal justice system by external experts, and they believed largely the system is an improvement over what we had before. It has made a good start, and it has met and continues to meet the key benchmarks that the General Assembly established for it, which were independence, the transparency, the professionalization, decentralization, and resourcing. So we're off to a good start. I believe that we can never do enough in terms of giving information to staff members and stakeholders about how the system operates. And so one of the areas which we're focusing on as Office of Administration of Justice is making sure that staff can access to jurisprudence. Because when staff members, regardless of name, rank, job title, have access to the jurisprudence, they can make better decisions. Managers can make better decisions, but also staff members can be better informed around their obligations and their accountabilities and the accountabilities of their managers.
And in the last minute we have, what do you see as your major challenge as you move forward?
The major challenge is just continuing to get information out to staff, reassuring them that the system works, because if the system isn't seen as credible, they won't use it. And part of the credibility of the system is that we have timely judgments, that there's a high quality of justice, and that staff believe that if they have an issue, they can get effective recourse. And it's really communicating about that, because we are delivering that. But having individuals, especially new ones in the workforce who may not be so familiar with how the organization operates, building their confidence, but also, believe more importantly than that, getting everybody to understand that the workplace is a shared space. And every day that we come to work, we should bring our best self. Because if we can bring our best self and foster trust, then we create an environment that where everybody who comes in can give of their best. And I think ultimately as an organization, that is what we promote in the United Nations. Bring your best self to work. And in your interactions with each other, be mindful that the other person also is trying to bring their best self.
Those are words to live by for every organization out there that has one or more employees.
Absolutely.
It is actually so important to do that, and it has been. The people I've talked to, of course I did not know that much about the inner operations of the UN, but they have commented that it has gotten much more professional over the last 10, 15, well, maybe even 20 years than it was during the early days, and that's understandable. As you mentioned, organizations mature, they learn, they progress, they see what's worked and they see what hasn't worked, and they see how they can make the organization a better organization so that it benefits not only the people who are benefiting from the services that are provided by UN agencies who are working with the UN Children's Fund or whatever, the World Food Program or UN High Commission for Refugees or whatever, but anywhere within the UN system, as with any organization, a private sector organization would want to do the same type of thing and provide these services. But it's absolutely critical that we focus on these issues. And I really, Alayne Frankson Wallace, I want to thank you so very much for bringing us up to date on this very interesting aspect that we don't read very much about or anything about in the UN, but thank you for a very interesting and very informative program.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, my pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.